Hi, I'm Namrata, and this is MedTech Juju, where we're going to talk about all things MedTech. So sign up and enjoy the ride.
Let's begin now.
You know, today, I just woke up and I
Like
said,
this.
instead of waiting on a good day, waiting around through ups and downs, waiting on something to happen, I just said,
We're gonna have a good day, and all my homies gonna ride today.
that's right.
And all these mommies look fly today, and all we wanna do is get by today.
Hi, I'm
Have
Namrata,
a good day.
dentist, startup executive, and founder of Naminar Pro. This is MedTech Juju.
Hey MedTech world. Today I wanted to talk a little bit about running a clinical investigation for a medical device. The reason I want to talk about this subject is because so many times people kind of get lost in their own process of how exactly to navigate this extremely critical element of making or developing a medical device, which is to gather clinical data. Clinical data is key for every medical device's success. In order to sell it effectively to the end user, which in most cases are actually doctors, they will always ask for clinical data. So running a good study is actually pretty critical. So I wanted to talk a little bit today about that aspect of the process of designing a clinical study, just to make sure that nobody ends up facing that horrid situation of notified bodies or regulatory authorities coming back to them and saying, hey, you know what? You did a study, okay, check, but you didn't do it to the standard that we actually expected. And then, lo and behold, the manufacturer goes like, wait, what? I have to go and do a study again? And so often I saw so many of my clients come back with a copy paste sometimes of the pre-market study that they did, which means before it's actually marketed. And then they copy paste that protocol as a post-market, just magically thinking that, adding a few pointers from the regulatory authorities' deficiencies would actually elevate the level of the study. But that's not the case here. They really need you to do a new study which follows the good clinical practices, or certain guidelines that are laid out in the standards that are intended to guide manufacturers on designing good studies. So what does the flow look like whenever we start actually designing a clinical study? For me, the flow that I usually follow is I immediately start thinking about the most similar devices to my device for which I have to design a clinical study. So my starting point is actually doing a thorough literature search on the most similar devices and kind of reviewing and analyzing how they're designing their studies. However, that doesn't mean that I have to exactly follow whatever's being written. Instead, I follow a 5-step process to make sure that my endpoints are reflective of not just what the market is showing me. When I read those articles, I already get a good insight on how the other people are designing their studies. Now, that doesn't mean that I have to copy paste exactly what they're doing, but it gives me a good standing on what clinicians expect to research in a device of that kind. What kind of endpoints do they prefer? What kind of things are they targeting? And how well developed the research behind such a device already is. How long back, how many decades has this technology been studied? So it gives us a good idea about how to found the study design for our own device. So I start with a thorough literature search, and I start with how am I going to think about my endpoints. If you're interested to learn about how to design your endpoints, there's a separate video that I've made, which is linked below, and you can go ahead and have a look at that foundation, which is really just focusing on the endpoints part of the protocol or the study design. So once I have a good idea of how similar device clinical studies are being designed, I then come back to planning my process for my devices study. So this usually starts with a nice overview of understanding the aims or the objective of my clinical study, right? What do I really want to show through my device? What is the strength of my device? What is something that makes sense from a safety perspective for my patients who will receive that device? It's already a thought process of what exactly do I want to prove through this study. And then as a second step, I jump into designing my protocol and thinking through what kind of elements am I going to need? Do I need a safety review board? What risk class is my device? If it's higher risk, then I have a whole lot of other things to consider in order to not get a pushback from my regulatory authorities later on. And also from the clinicians who will use the device, they need to make sure that safety is well taken care of, especially for high-risk devices. For low-risk devices, you can start thinking it's a little bit more flexible, and there are many avenues that we can discover. Do we really need a randomized study for a low-risk device? What is the purpose of collecting this data? Can we go with a non-randomized design, etc., etc.? Another thing that I always follow before I actually initiate the process is know your standard. Know the standard that you plan to follow for designing this clinical study. And the standard that I usually follow is ISO 14155, which is a great place to start off in case you're doing this for the first time or haven't done it a lot before. So go through that standard and really try and understand, what the requirements are and how to design a good study that will get minimal pushback from your end user as well as your regulators. So that's a great standard to follow for this purpose. When you go into that standard, ISO 14155, you will see that there are many other documentations that are needed to actually conduct a study. Now, most manufacturers could actually hire a CRO, a contract research organization, to conduct this for them. But those are the people who have the money to do a clinical study. And in most startups or small enterprises, it's really something that they have to consider very seriously because it's not cheap to run a study. So then it might make sense for you to take certain things in-house or to hire consultants to come and kind of help you develop this study. But it's also it's an interesting point to discover where in the world you should run your study if you want to cut costs, but not impact the final data that you would receive at the end. So there are many countries in the world where you could think about running a study which might prove a little bit less expensive as compared to other parts of the world. But it's really a balancing game that you're going to have to play. Where do you want to market the device? Who's going to be your key audience? Maybe the regulators need data from that country itself. So we're going to go through those factors within the progress of this channel. By the way, we're going to talk about different elements of, the clinical study process, talking about where to run it, what are the best countries, at what price points, what are the pros and cons, etc. So stay tuned in case you want to learn a little bit more about that. But eventually, when you go through this process, the variables, I would say, is where you want to run your study, how much is your budget to run that study, locating a good site and a good team to run the study for you. These are factors which it's always a good idea to involve externals or a CRO to support you, at least in guiding you towards the right places, and initiate that discussion with them. However, the one thing that should always be maintained is the quality of the data that you're going to get out of your study. And in order to have a good control over that aspect, it's a good idea to follow the ISO standard 14155. So for that, I always keep the standard at the back of my hand, and I designed a study with it in a way that I know that if it is run in this methodology and this process that we're following, which is given in the standard, you can then say at least the data that I'll get in the end will not be contested by my end user, the clinician, nor the regulatory authorities, in best case scenarios if it's done well. So keep the data as your foundation, and just make sure that you don't compromise on the quality of your data. The data needs to be consistent, and that happens when you design a good study following a good standard. There's a whole other list of documents that need to be created to run a study. You have investigator brochures, you have case report forms, also need your ethics committee approval, regulatory authority approvals, depending on which country you're running the study in. And all of this is, I would say, in the planning stage of the actual study process. Now, let's say that your study actually started. You figured all these things out, you wrote a protocol, you wrote all the documentation, you got the approval, and now your study is about to start. So now who are the people involved to support you in this process? You're going to have study monitors involved who will go and monitor and make sure that your study is running properly. You can hire monitors independently who can do this for you. There are a lot of freelance monitors out there who just do this. Or you could hire a CRO that actually gives you the whole package, including the monitoring of the study. Irrespective, make sure that you have a good monitoring plan in place and the monitor understands precisely what their responsibilities are. Again, hiring externals or some kind of external support or some kind of subject matter experts on clinical studies is sometimes a good idea, especially for small enterprises or startups. Instead of just trying everything on your own, always have an expert go through what you're planning to make sure that whatever market you're targeting your device towards, they should be an expert on that market too, so that they can tell you that, hey, you know what, this design might not actually cut it for this country that you're planning to sell your device in, because the regulators are actually very strict about the design of the protocol, etc., etc. So that was part of my responsibility. I used to tell people, okay, if you plan to do it in Germany, okay, here's where, this part of the protocol might be a little bit contesting according to the German authorities, or if you're planning to do it in France, or if you're planning to do it in Italy, here's the things to consider based on the local authorities of that place. So that's the kind of input you could get from a good consultant to support you in your study. And when your study is running, the safety reporting is a whole kind of process on its own. We need to make sure that all of the adverse events or the safety events happening are recorded very, very diligently. And there is a whole different process that needs to be followed to make sure that the safety reporting is being done properly, especially based on the risk class of the device. And a lot of local regulatory authorities have their own methods that tell you what their requirements are. How often do they need updates on the safety reporting? What kind of safety events are higher priority and must be informed immediately to the authorities? Whose responsibility is it to inform the authorities? Is it the principal investigator? Is it the sponsor? Is it both? These are kind of questions that you can always dig deep into the local regulations and figure out. And your external consultants can also tell that to you. So this is very unique to the country where you're going to be running your study in. However, it is broadly defined by the national level regulation being followed in that region. So for example, in Europe, it's the medical device regulation, MDR. And the MDR pretty clearly kind of defines what kind of safety events are supposed to be reported and how many calendar days. It goes down pretty deep, but all of this information is available for anybody who needs to understand it before they actually dive in to run a study. And once the entire study is near closure, the final step would be a close down of the site. But there is a whole process written in place. How do you close down a study properly? Make sure that all the devices are removed from the site, back at the sponsors, everything is disposed of properly, all the patients' follow-ups are completed, the last patient's last follow-up is done, all the data is well collected, there's no more confusion around the data. And then that's usually when one would start closing down the study. And finally, we have the clinical investigation report, which is written once all that data is analyzed. A lot of other parties are involved in a clinical study. You have something called a safety monitoring board, and you also have to think about the biases. Who in my study could bring a bias in, and how do I avoid that bias? So in medical devices, it's pretty different from the pharma world where, if I have two pills that look precisely the same, it's hard to tell which one is the real pill and which one is a placebo. But in medical devices, they pretty much, you can tell because it's right there in the doctor's hand. He can tell what device he's holding. Even in randomized studies with 3-4 study groups, it doesn't matter, but you can tell. It's hard to blind the user to the actual device and also the patient. And what usually happens in these cases, how do medical device clinical investigations bypass this bias? What elements do we put in place? This is where a medical device study design differs from that of a pharma study design. This is one of the examples, right? The statistics is different. It's a different approach to the whole process. So when you're looking at externals to support you with your project of designing a study, try and find someone who has a medical device study background and somebody who understands the uniqueness and specificities of designing a device study and not just a pharma study. Now, when it comes to all the documentation that was gathered during a clinical study, there's something called a trial master file, where you put all of the information that was gathered. Folders and dossiers are kept per patient. Everything is anonymized properly. There's a whole list of things that goes into the documentation part. And once all that data is analyzed, finally a report is created, which is what the regulators ask for before they actually approve your device. They need to see that the data is well collected. The study was actually run how it was designed. It was actually conducted the way that the process is defined in the beginning. When they see all the results, then the regulators are in a position to say yes or no, can this study be accepted, and is it showing sufficient data to say that, okay, now you can release this device or market this device in this specific market. So even after a study is officially finished, the part that starts afterwards takes a while. Whenever you have follow-up points, gather the data from that follow-up point, start planning ahead about your report, have your templates in place, however you can, to make sure that that burden doesn't come on you right at the end. Plan it well in advance because it's coming, And finally, I would end with saying that, whenever we think about a clinical study for a medical device, we want to, what is our goal really? We want to make sure that it's safe for the human beings on which it will be used, or will use it themselves. And it is performing according to what the manufacturer intended it to do. And a clinical study is a great means to gather the data to show that it performs and is safe. And also keep in mind that when you have a clinical investigation, there's a lot of different types of them. So you could have a pre-market study, you could have a post-market study. What's a first in human or first in man? What's a pilot study? What's a pivotal study? There's a whole lot of classification systems and terminologies that make sense for the person who plans to work in this area, and also maybe for executives and senior leadership management people to be aware of before they actually manage these massive projects, which is running an actual study for your device. So for both these groups of people, I would say it's a good idea to go through at least the basic terminologies and the flow of the processes and the differences between different kinds, just to be more confident in your ability to manage them well. If you're interested in such kind of content, then we drop free PDFs for everyone who watches our videos and follows us. So have a look at the description below and see if we've uploaded a free PDF for you to take advantage of, and just keep yourself up to par with what exactly is needed in the world of clinical investigations for medical devices. So in this video, we basically, just to summarize, we kind of covered an overview of what exactly goes into a clinical investigation for a medical device, who are the players involved, the key players, what is the process and the documentation involved, and eventually what's the final goal that we're aiming towards when we think about running a clinical study. And with that, I hope that you found some value in the content that I shared today. If you want to follow more such content, then please go ahead and follow MedTech Juju, and I'll see you next time. Ciao. Come on.